Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to stand here today in this rotunda. And may I congratulate the organizers on choosing a rotunda for a particular reason. The last time that I spoke beneath such a dome was rather more spontaneous, and it was just a little up the road in Methodist Central Hall. And it was late on the night of the 31st of January 2020. It was Brexit exit night, and we had all been reveling and frivoling in Trafalgar Square, and I was there with some of my colleagues from the editorial board of Briefings for Britain, the Cambridge-based website, which some of you may know. And in the melee, this effervescent crowd of people from goodness knows where, we found ourselves being swept along in a phalanx of French Brexiteers. And they brought us to their rally, which was in Methodist Central Hall. And so my memory of that momentous night was of making an impromptu speech, along with other of the Francophone BFB colleagues, to a tumultuous audience of hundreds of Union Jack waving, cheering Frenchmen and women, our sweet enemies, as Robert and Isabel Toombs call our neighbors in their eponymous book. Domes, I'm sure I don't have to remind you, have been very special spaces from classical times. The Pantheon. The clue is in the Greek. All the gods. Domes are a sort of lens which focus seen and unseen powers. So from the Pantheon in Rome to the Panthéon in Paris to the Congress in Washington, many other legislators around the world, to Methodist Central Hall, to here we are today. And I mention this because, having sat through this interesting conference, I have a feeling, and I wonder if you share it, that maybe this rotunda's been doing its bit of magic, because there is a sense of power among us here. Something has been stirring in this conference. And I would suggest that now is for us, as it was for Dr. Manette recalled to life, the best of times and the worst of times, which brings me to my brief. Hard times demand hard thought, and hard thinking is allergic to the coddled mind in Jonathan Haidt's apt and uncomfortable coinage, with its self-preoccupation within the echo chamber of its lived experiences, and with maintaining the blocks to falsifying its many cult-like beliefs. My brief today is realism in foreign policy, which is a fraught picture. In their own terms, I take as read and applaud the importance of the new Japanese defense agreements which this country has struck, agreements which inscribe a century-long circle back for both countries to a geopolitically natural alliance. And I also applaud AUKUS and the CPTPP, which are the basis for a Pacific NATO and a free trade supersession of the superannuated WTO, respectively. And particularly, I take as read the formidable geopolitical commonwealth of the Commonwealth as Britain's unique soft power, trade power, and hard power instrument, if we believe in it and we believe in ourselves as a force for good in dark times. However, because so many, particularly in the establishment, called by Michael Gove so accurately the blob, and especially the omnipresent heirs to Blair, have drunk the hemlock of declinism since Suez, such that both of those empirically well-grounded beliefs are widely contested or denied, perforce, my purpose here and now is to explain the consequence which declinism creates, which is that we are obliged, thus burdened, to defend ourselves from active measures, which Richard will shortly explain, taken against us by our unencumbered enemies. My concerns with cult-like beliefs here today, therefore, are not substantive, not with the anthropological characterization of those thought patterns. Those have been the concerns of many previous speakers in this conference. Edward Burnett Tyler's Primitive Culture, published in 1871, is as fresh and relevant in explaining modern woke thinking as it was during those protean years from 1859 to 1871, which were years that embraced the publication of Darwin, of John Stuart Mill, of Sir Henry Maine, he of contract moving from status, of Bagehot, of W.S. Jevons, of Tyler himself, when Tyler explained in that book why witch doctors continued to believe in their methods in the face of all disproving evidence, which is the defining feature of cult-like belief. I therefore want to highlight the instrumental way in which the entire linked woke agenda has contributed to the cultural disarmament of the free world, and especially the English-speaking parts. And I do mean, ladies and gentlemen, entire, for the same reasons that Kevin Roberts rehearsed in his bravura keynote just earlier this morning. For the avoidance of doubt, this extraordinary agenda of popular delusions that feed the madness of crowds has, while we were laughing and not paying attention, produced a whole orchard of poisoned fruit, which we're now obliged to eat. From the racism of critical race theory to obsessional misrepresentation of every aspect of our history as a source of shame. From the cruel weaponization of gender dysmorphia and the irritating nonsense of pronouns ridiculously deemed non-offensive, to Orwellian self-editing of speech and prose. It also embraces the specific scientific illiteracy of climate catastrophism, which is a victim, for those who study these things, of Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness, with its publicity-speaking cultists who delighted us long enough with their presence here yesterday, and the thermodynamic incompetence and the economic self-harming of trying to distill sunbeams from cucumbers in the futile pursuit of the lazily embedded virtue signal, which is called net zero, which our politicians bandy about, but few actually understand, not even remotely. It really helps, ladies and gentlemen, to know the second law of thermodynamics, even the first. Laws which, inconveniently for them, no politicians can actually break without consequence. Every part is not necessarily interlinked conspiratorially, although that's not to say there are not some that are, but they are all linked operationally, and that is today's vital point in this talk. Now, the oral mnemonic, which you need to remember, is probably known to everybody in this audience who's ever been the parent of primary school children in the last 50 years. So, are you ready? Here we go. The legs bones linked to the foot bones linked to the leg bone, and the leg bones linked to the knee bone, and the knee bones linked to the thigh bone, doing the skeleton dance, which sounds... It's all right. Had we time, we could go on and do the part where there are real hand movements. It sounds vaguely Caribbean, but it's actually Walt Disney in 1929 with a touch of medieval danse macabre. But the point is this. Just as a competent orthopedic surgeon knows intimately those linkages in the body and the tendon inserts and the musculature, and just as a good diagnostician knows that a painful big toe might be a symptom of gout and not just of an ill-fitting boot, so those who study and practice modern geopolitics need, by analogy, to be informed about real and present interlinkages, many of them not that obvious. For example, such as today, how the timing of Sudan's torment is, via the Wagner Group, a bloody expansion of the Ukraine war into the Nile Valley. After 6 rampant years, in my view, none of this woke spectrum commands intellectual or moral respect, any more than E.B. Tyler respected the witch doctors whose conduct he sought to understand and to explain. And after the 24th of February 22, this critique must now go farther. It's not just, as Douglas, speaking I think for us all last night, said, that we now have no more time or patience to engage with this. It is on urgent grounds of national security that the woke cults can no longer be tolerated. That's brave applause, because that's a strong statement. But why? Because they make the defense of freedom against its enemies much harder than it was for previous generations. And because they give active help to enemies who employ active measures against us. And this gives added salience to the trailblazing work of Douglas Murray himself and to Melanie Phillips and other thinkers of importance who are here today. Self-harmed as we are, our enemies eagerly sniff out and exploit weakness. Dr. Radomir Tilkut, who I spot at the back, was first to document the sheer scale of the People's Republic of China and Ministry of State Security United Front Work Department's penetration into the most sensitive aspects of British defence science and research. Its malign and skillful activities across wider academia and the heights of scientific publishing were and simply are formidable. The UFWD really made hay while the sun shone during the post-11/11 era, when erroneously and complacently it was assumed for 2 decades that admitting the Chinese Communist Party's China into the World Trade Organization would make them somehow more like us. At best, under Hu Jintao, Chinese policy was governed by the first of the 36 stratagems from the era of the Warring States, the one which advises to deceive the skies in order to cross the seas. And at worst, which is now, under Xi Jinping, it aims to realize the China dream of hegemony by the time of the Communist Party's centenary, the 100-year marathon, as it was first so named by Colonel Liu Mingfu in his now famous 2009 book, The China Dream. The sinologist Michael Pillsbury specifies just how central the lessons from the era of the Warring States in the 5th century BCE are today to China's hawks. Ladies and gentlemen, hard times are new times for us, but they are not new in living memory. The democracies have been here twice before, once at the outer limit of memory in the 1930s, and again, for most of us, during the Cold War. In those episodes, whatever the disagreements might have been between hawks and doves over appeasement or détente, there was an unquestioned underlying confidence that ours were virtuous countries of which we could be and were proud, countries that were a role model for many. I'll just offer you a small vignette. When I was working in NATO, I once conducted a memorable informal Sherpa mission, as these things are called in diplomacy, to meet President Havel as we worked out what Czechoslovakia, as it still was, wanted to do next. And over tea, sitting in the Hrad Castle, is what he said. He said, "Dear Doctor, if you offer us membership of NATO, we will join. If you offer us membership of the EEC, as it then was, the European Economic Community, we will join. If you offer us membership of a ladies' flower arranging circle, we will join, because we want by every and any means to return to the beating heart of Europe. And I think Richard heard much the same messages in Kiev a fortnight ago. But we, Great Britain, we shine a beacon wider still and wider across the Commonwealth, among ordinary people, not necessarily the elites, not the nationalist elites, ordinary people who remember British colonial rule with affection and who value its encompassing legacies today, as I can also attest from many years living and working in rural Africa. But quite suddenly, under comprehensive onslaught, we no longer believe in ourselves. And this pernicious cultural disarmament comes just at the end of history, that comforting belief that liberal democracy was finally in the ascendant, which Putin smashed on the 24th of February last year. So therefore, we meet here today in this comfortable rotunda in time of war. Hot war for the Ukrainians, grey war for us. What does that mean? That means information war. It means psychological warfare. It means electronic warfare. It means, very importantly, energy warfare, active measures. And in time of war, we need urgently to understand ourselves and to understand our enemies if we are to be safe in 1,000 battles. And this demands, ladies and gentlemen, old thought, and not just Sun Tzu from the 5th century BCE, and this is no paradox. Over the last 18 months, Western foreign policy establishments have generally had great difficulty in recognizing the full inter-articulations, the skeleton dance, if you like, of Putin's invasion. The second articulation is still not fully grasped, namely, that defeat of Putin is prerequisite to successful deterrence of Xi Jinping's ambitions as part of the China dream to do to Taiwan what we have helplessly watched happen to Hong Kong just recently, with the final crushing of democracy, itself a sad consequence, as predicted at that time by Hong Kong Democrats like the great Emily Lau, of Blair's and the FCO's declinist kowtow in 1997, which, on becoming Prime Minister, was part of Blair's serial surrenders of British positions of strength at home and abroad. And the other surrender of note, of course, was to the IRA the following year, and just at the moment, as a matter of fact, when the British Army had a bead on all of them. And make no mistake, devolution and self-harming of energy resilience, they're all in the same box. Meanwhile, President Macron's domestic impotence translates into dangerous displacement activity for him that fractures the British-led solidarity with Ukraine in three ways: by his freelance appeasement diplomacy, first with Putin, and secondly, latterly and more ridiculously, with Xi Jinping, all of which play into the hands of those dictators. And thirdly, it is by renewed EU efforts, acting as a French sock puppet, to interpose itself into military and security affairs. And this has occurred over shell production for Ukraine, for example, which tries obnoxiously to cut this country out in favor of the French arms industry, and more recently by now claiming a spurious EU lead of a North Sea coalition for protection of energy and information infrastructures. Bluntly, the EU has no business in any such matters, which are sovereign state responsibilities, or NATO's. Along with this, I will be explaining to a select committee tomorrow in the House of Commons. So what then to do? National conservatism, which is expressed in my mind, as I think in the minds of many here, as the Burkean compact between the dead, the living, and the unborn, must surely, in foreign policy affairs, find its first expression in breaking the mind-forged manacles that hold captive the coddled minds, to reclaim our history, and hence intellectual self-confidence. because Britain's extraordinary role in ending the Atlantic slave trade, or in 19th century invention and innovation, or in saving Europe from itself 3 times since 1800, or in the generally positive audit of our colonial stewardship compared to any others, these are matters of national pride. And the vitality of the Commonwealth is external validation of that final point, and our general debt, if I may single him out, to Nigel Biggar for his recent book on colonialism, a moral audit, and also to his Grace Under Fire, as he has been serially cancelled, is immense. Secondly, we should accept leadership when it falls to us to lead, as it did in this country under Prime Minister Boris Johnson in February of 22. We should know our strength and mobilize materially to deter authoritarian enemies who do not think like us and with whom no deals can be cut. And I think, as Richard will shortly argue, it is time to get off our knees. National conservatism should, in short, understand that for societies like ours, which, despite our undoubted blemishes, are morally admirable, nations in which less fortunate people long to live, realism, in application of Sun Tzu's advice, is in fact a form of practical idealism. As Immanuel Kant put it in 1784, and I quote, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from self-incurred immaturity." I'm emphasizing it, but what a profound but simple insight. Sapere aude, dare to know, have courage to use your own understanding. The founder of modern geopolitics, Sir Halford Mackinder, succinctly added in 1919, and here's the closing thought: "Let us recover possession of ourselves, lest we become the mere slaves of the world's geography," to which I would add the slaves to the dominion of those who would do us harm. Thank you.